Back in 2014, Sony's plans for The Amazing Spider-Man 2's sequels and spin-offs were stalled when the movie was met with mixed reviews and relatively disappointing financial returns. Around the same time, fan support to get Spider-Man included in the Marvel Cinematic Universe vastly increased, though Sony publicly had no intent to sell the rights back to Marvel due to their own financial problems. Although both Sony Pictures and Marvel Studios were able to make a deal in the end, the amount of work needed to get to that point was quite extensive, and involved a major security breach and a great amount of legal negotiation. Today, we'll be talking about the trouble Sony faced from behind the scenes, how they reached a deal with Marvel Studios, and what the future holds in store for the web-slinger. On January 2, 2014, the financial website Macro Access reported that the Sony Corporation had a 78% chance of going bankrupt by the same fiscal quarter in 2016. While that number has since decreased to 24%, due largely to the success of Sony's PlayStation 4, the company was suffering from a number of problems in nearly every other format they have sold products in. Their film division, of course, also suffered due to a lack of sustainable franchises compared to their competitors, and the continued success of the Spider-Man franchise over Sony Entertainment's other movie series is what made the company so apprehensive about selling the rights to Marvel Studios wholesale. Sony Entertainment co-chairwoman Amy Pascal said outright that she and her company would never sell the rights back after rumors to the contrary first appeared. To her credit, this was a wise business decision. The vast majority of the properties that have reverted to Marvel experience middling returns at best, and Spider-Man was still leaving a mark at the box office for Sony, making nearly $4 billion between 5 films. Sony's biggest financial problems with the Spider-Man franchise can be linked to how they did not possess the merchandising rights after the reboot, since they had traded them with Disney for other financial benefits. As mentioned in the previous video, Sony made a trade with Marvel Studios. All money made off of the merchandise would go to Disney, while Sony would make any and all money off of the Spider-Man films, including home video sales. The reasoning behind this business decision is that they would make 100% of the money off of the films instead of having to pay a portion of the returns to Marvel, a standard part of every Marvel film contract. As a whole, Marvel's merchandise is exponentially more profitable than their biggest competitor, DC, and the Spider-Man franchise is the key reason why. This is extremely important because, as of 2014, the year The Amazing Spider-Man 2 was released, the merchandise for the Spider-Man franchise is far and away more profitable than any other character under the Marvel brand, being worth an estimated $1.3 billion at the time. While a few massive hits in a single year would effectively be more beneficial for Sony than the merchandise alone, since they were adopting the shared universe format that they thought could rival other studios, completely giving up control of the merchandise would prove to be an Achilles heel for Sony. This was the key reason why The Amazing Spider-Man 2, which grossed over $700 million in theaters on a budget of over $250 million, was considered a commercial disappointment, and the absence of that additional source of revenue was duly noted from within Sony as their financial problems escalated. Reportedly, Pascal had hoped The Amazing Spider-Man 2 would gross closer to $1 billion, which the movie had fallen a few hundred million short of making. The original plan for Sony's The Amazing Spider-Man series was to get a movie out every year from 2016 onwards, with a few years having multiple films. Sinister Six, which was to be directed by Drew Goddard, was originally scheduled after the release of The Amazing Spider-Man 3, and was seemingly intended to be a spin-off with some of the villains introduced in that film, but issues from within complicated matters. Andrew Garfield was reportedly hoping that if they made Sinister Six before The Amazing Spider-Man 3, that it would conclude his 3-movie contract. Unbeknownst to Garfield, Sony planned to pay him less for the film due to his decreased amount of screen time, and for budgetary reasons, though he was later fired anyway. Oddly enough, Pascal worried that the use of the word sinister in the title would potentially scare international audiences away from the film, or that people would mistake the movie for a sequel to the then-recent horror movie, Sinister. One of the biggest concerns with Sinister Six turned out not to be the concept itself, which Sony had a surprising amount of confidence in, but in 2 superhero movies it would have to compete with in 2016, Suicide Squad and Doctor Strange. The former had a similar concept of a villain-led team, and a team with a much richer history than Spider-Man's own team of nemesis, meaning that Sony would have to work fast to beat DC to the punch. The latter had a release date that came the week after Sinister Six's intended release date, which could have adversely affected the movie's performance. Matters were made worse for Sony when Suicide Squad's release was placed in early August, a full 3 months before Sinister Six's planned release date, and Warner Brothers had a lot more to show for their plans than Sony did with their own movies. Not helping matters was that Goddard ran into trouble with Marvel for agreeing to direct the movie when he hadn't finished his duties as showrunner for Daredevil. All of this amounted to the movie being pushed further back, which complicated Sony's planned slate of movies even more. We'll be sure to give you greater details on what Sony had in mind for the franchise in the last video of this series. Sony also had to contend with a brain drain of directors they had wanted to work with, as Rian Johnson, David Ayer, Scott Derrickson, Neil Blomkamp, Roland Emmerich, and Josh Trank, among others, were all making movies at different studios. Sony had plans to pursue the following directors to helm future movies: Brad Bird, Chris Buck and Jennifer Lee, Damien Chazelle, Joe Cornish, Glenn Ficarra and John Requa, James Gunn, Don Hall and Chris Williams, Phil Lord and Chris Miller, Joachim Roning and Espen Sandberg, Colin Trevorrow, Edgar Wright, and David Yates. At one point, Sony even considered in seeing if Spider-Man trilogy director Sam Raimi would be interested in returning to helm another movie, or serve as a creative advisor for several future Spider-Man films. Expanding upon this idea, it was suggested that Raimi could lead a creative committee that would serve as the Spider-Man Brain Trust. A list of candidates included David Koepp, Michael Arndt, Simon Beaufoy, Simon Kinberg, Matthew Vaughn, Brian Michael Bendis, J. Michael Straczynski, and Todd McFarlane. As it turned out, help from Marvel Studios came long before an extensive creative team could be assembled. Due to Disney's control over the Spider-Man merchandise and profits, the company has been much more lenient in promoting the Spider-Man films that Sony Pictures has produced than it has been to 20th Century Fox, who own the film rights to X-Men and Fantastic Four. Nonetheless, Marvel still had an interest in bringing the Wallcrawler into their films in order to boost their already high profits and provide a strong foundation for the future after the end of Phase 3. Marvel Studios had allegedly offered billions of dollars to Sony for a complete buyout of the property on a few occasions, but Sony rejected the offers due to their financial concerns as a whole, especially those related to their film slate, which, as mentioned earlier, was lacking franchises that could pull in high returns. Even still, this didn't stop speculation of a potential deal from spreading like wildfire over the internet. On October 6th, 2014, Drew McQueenie of HitFix posited that some of his sources were suggesting that a deal was underway, although he did not have actual confirmation on this. This speculation caused something of a chain reaction within Marvel and Sony, as representatives from both parties caught wind of the rumors as publications like the New York Times and Entertainment Weekly were planning on reporting it. The emails involved in the conversation went all the way to the CEOs of Sony Entertainment and Marvel Entertainment, Michael Linton and Ike Perlmutter, respectively. Perlmutter didn't see Spider-Man's inclusion in Captain America: Civil War as a huge boost for Marvel Studios, but he did think it would be beneficial for Sony. Linton agreed to further discussions with Perlmutter on a negotiation, but Sony's public stance will be to continue to deny the possibility of a deal and instead promote the planned sequels and spin-offs. Even Tom Rothman, the chairman of the TriStar Pictures division, who has a history of questionable decisions concerning comic book movies, agreed that a rights-sharing deal would be hugely beneficial to Sony in a separate conversation, explicitly mentioning Captain America, Black Widow, Thor, and Hulk as characters that would fit in well with the movies they were already making. Rothman also wanted to make it clear that such a partnership would not necessarily be permanent, and that Sony should be primarily concerned with promoting its own movies first and foremost. To this end, Amy Pascal suggested that Sony and Marvel make a one-time deal for each studio to promote the other's movies. Spider-Man would appear in Captain America: Civil War, and Captain America would appear in Sinister Six. Afterward, the two continuities would largely remain separate unless another deal was made. The finances of the deal would be a bit of an adjustment from the existing contract, involving Sony owning 25% of Marvel's film and Marvel owning 25% of Sony's film. It was also suggested that Marvel hire their own actor as Spider-Man in order to avoid complications with Andrew Garfield's contract, even as it seemed as though Sony was looking to replace Garfield. Even then, this deal was stalled as Sinister Six ran into the previously mentioned creative issues. Sony had also looked into hiring Joe and Anthony Russo, the directors behind Captain America: The Winter Soldier and Captain America: Civil War, to work on a number of films on a 3-year contract. Joe Russo offered to serve as a producer alongside his brother for some of the future Spider-Man movies as part of the deal. Given the duo's involvement, it would likely result in some kind of greater deal with Marvel Studios, who were, at this point, considering rebooting the character within the MCU, as opposed to going through with a complicated crossover. Marvel was also interested in a deal where the costs of future Spider-Man films were split 60-40 between Marvel and Sony respectively, but Sony rejected this when Marvel wanted full creative control. On October 30th, 2014, Columbia Pictures president, Doug Belgrad, put forth a suggestion that would serve as the basis for the deal that would eventually be made. Belgrad said, quote, "In this scenario, where Marvel produces a trilogy of new Spider-Man movies for Sony and we retain creative control, marketing, and distribution, it's actually an easy deal to make. We don't need them to make any kind of big payment. This would automatically create tons of value for Sony by reinvigorating the character. And it's even possible that adjacent to the trilogy, we could do a Sinister Six movie involving Spider-Man and get them to grant us a one-time use of the Shadowlands rights that we might need." End quote. The Shadowlands refers to the Savage Land, a location that Drew Goddard wanted to use in Sinister Six. Pascal was in favor of the deal, and she wanted the second Spider-Man movie in the series to come out in 2019, since Marvel apparently wanted to use Spider-Man in both parts of Avengers: Infinity War. While none of these planned deals worked out exactly the way either company had intended, a major breach of corporate security was about to force Sony's hand and accelerate a collaboration between the two companies. In a plot so devious that only a former Green Goblin actor could have been behind it, James Franco and Seth Rogen began work on The Interview, a unique take on the buddy comedy genre revolving around the assassination of North Korean Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un. Naturally, the film's premise was deemed insensitive by the North Korean government, and a group of hackers calling themselves the Guardians of Peace took action against the company by stealing a substantial amount of files from Sony. Following the hack, the group also threatened terrorist actions if The Interview were released, although the threats were hollow even with the movie's significantly limited release. Information leaked by the hack included a number of emails, financial information about various movies, social security and healthcare information from various employees, and even a few finished films that had yet to be released. According to some of Sony's former employees, the event was a long time coming due to the security team being vastly understaffed with a mere 11 people. What vulnerabilities that the team could find with their limited manpower would remain exposed due to a lack of concern from the higher-ups in charge. In the end, the hack cost Sony $35 million in repairs, and even more with the films that had been leaked. The leaked emails provided a wealth of information revealing a number of Sony's corporate secrets. Several of Sony's major productions, including movies that had yet to be released, were harshly criticized by the people in charge, negatively affecting their box office take upon release. A list of internal complaints about the way the company ran things made its way to the public. Amy Pascal had made an insensitive remark regarding President Barack Obama, which she would quickly apologize for when the news leaked out. The entire experience was hugely embarrassing for the company, as news outlets worldwide reported on the findings. Most importantly, however, was that a wealth of information about the Spider-Man franchise was unveiled, and with it, discussions of the character's possible integration into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. With the information of Sony's talks with Marvel about a deal going public, fan support for Spider-Man's appearance in the MCU drastically increased as more and more pressure was placed upon Sony. On December 12, 2014, a Change.org petition calling for Sony to renegotiate a deal with Marvel quickly gained over 22,000 signatures in less than 2 months. A social media campaign called Bring Spidey Home, promoting the petition and a Sony-Marvel partnership in general, quickly gained traction as more information was revealed and rumors of a partnership continued. Sony would be expected to declare an official stance on the matter in the near future in direct response to fan outcry, and plans for one such discussion about the future of the franchise were already underway. In January of 2015, just before the hack took place, Sony officials expressed interest in holding a Spidey Summit to discuss what they needed to do with their sequels and spin-offs. Beyond the typical financial analysis that the meeting would entail, it would also serve as the primary means to get an actual film slate together after no real progress had been made. The officials were insistent upon getting Sinister Six made, alongside Venom, the female-led spin-off, and the planned sequels to The Amazing Spider-Man 2. But they wanted a clearer organization on the projects that they were working on, as the then recent announcements of DC and Marvel's exhaustive plans for 2016 through 2020 were making the people at Sony Pictures nervous. Amy Pascal suggested that Marvel Studios mogul Kevin Feige attend the meeting to offer his perspective, along with the producers and writers of the planned movies set in the established world of the two Amazing Spider-Man movies. Once the hack occurred, Feige's presence at the event went from being optional to a necessity. According to Day 7E Gonzalez of Latino Review, the Sony Corporation were furious over the leaks and were disappointed in the quality of The Amazing Spider-Man and its sequel, leaving them in favor of forming a deal with Marvel. The deal, therefore, would logically become the central topic of discussion at the Spidey Summit, and figuring out how the deal would work took precedence over the planned spin-offs. February was rumored to be the month where the results of the meeting in Pinewood Studios would be announced. Feige and Pascal both attended the meeting. The latter stepped down from her position at Sony shortly afterward. Regardless of what came out of the meeting, the only certainty at that point was that Andrew Garfield would not be returning to the role of Peter Parker. While Sony would issue a public denial about their plans, as covered by Josh Wilding on comicbookmovie.com, everything continued in secret. The exact details of the summit were never officially revealed, as the meeting happened behind closed doors. However, a pair of Reddit users seem to have filled in some of the key bits of information. Given that the information comes from Reddit, this should be taken with a grain of salt, though the content discussed here does match up with later reports. The first user, Reddit Leaker 23456, claimed that a 40-minute mini-meeting occurred days before the Spidey Summit to figure out how to integrate the character into the Marvel Cinematic Universe with a trilogy of films, and that Avi Arad, who produced the first 5 Spider-Man movies, would most likely stay away from the new projects. He also went on to note that part of the deal would grant Sony some of the profits from merchandise, while Marvel would have a good degree of creative control over the films themselves. The second user, Josh Evans 123, released an account of what happened at the meeting. Amy Pascal was said to have been in favor of keeping Andrew Garfield as Peter Parker, in spite of other Sony representatives disagreeing on this front. While Sony apparently wanted to co-produce certain films on 2 other Marvel properties that Marvel Studios owned. Kevin Feige and the Marvel Studios representatives were said to have considered integrating the story started by The Amazing Spider-Man into the MCU, but ultimately decided that a reboot would be the best fit for the character, especially considering that Marvel was allegedly concerned with Sony's planned spin-offs. While both posts were met with skepticism, a confirmation of some of the major details the Redditors described was unveiled. Finally, on February 9th, 2015, it was formally announced that Marvel Studios and Sony Pictures had come to a deal to share the character rights. Incidentally, just around the time the rights would have reverted back to Marvel wholesale had Sony not made The Amazing Spider-Man. Sony Pictures would still retain the Spider-Man rights and make money off of the standalone films, but they would be allowed to bring the characters of the Marvel Cinematic Universe into the movies co-produced by Marvel Studios, giving them a much greater degree of creative freedom and potentially greater financial returns. Sony would also be permitted to make spin-offs that would not necessarily be set in the MCU, meaning that the planned animated movie could serve as a viable franchise for the years without a standalone Spider-Man movie. In return, Marvel Studios would be able to use Spider-Man and his supporting cast in the ensemble films of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Marvel Studios would make the bulk of the money on their movies, while Sony Pictures would make the majority of the money on their movies. It was also announced that Kevin Feige and Marvel Studios would be producing the 2017 Spider-Man film with Sony Pictures, with Amy Pascal serving as primary producer from Sony's end. Before this, however, the character would first be rebooted through another Marvel Cinematic Universe movie, which was revealed to be Captain America: Civil War months later, as many had speculated. It was also confirmed early on that the reboot would not be retelling Spider-Man's origin, and he would have a whole year of experience as a superhero in the first movie in which he would be introduced. Some of the specific details have also been revealed. First and foremost, it costs neither party anything to have a film with a crossover from either Spider-Man's ensemble or the rest of the MCU. Feige has also noted that the current deal covers movies to productions that wrap in 2019, which currently serves as the year that Phase 3 of the MCU is set to end, although it will likely be extended as more solo Spider-Man movies are made. However, the deal also includes a number of limitations at the time of this writing. Marvel cannot use Spider-Man characters in their television and Netflix shows without Sony's permission, in spite of Marvel owning the live-action TV rights. In addition, Sony has the final call in regards to how Spider-Man is advertised in one of Marvel's ensemble pictures, which is why Spider-Man was revealed less than 2 months before the release of Captain America: Civil War. In fact, Sony was rumored to have asked Marvel to delay the release of the second Captain America: Civil War trailer by a week, so they could unveil the first trailer for the Ghostbusters reboot on March 3rd. Sony also gets to make the final creative decisions regarding the direction that the MCU Spider-Man films will take, although it seems highly likely that Sony will look to Marvel for large amounts of creative input. This appears to be the case as evidenced by Feige's later statement that Marvel is responsible for casting, writing, and filming. Sony, conversely, will merely be producing the film alongside Marvel Studios. Jon Watts is set to direct the film. Tom Holland was hired to play Peter Parker after an extensive audition process that also involved testing the young actor against Chris Evans and Robert Downey Jr. Andrew Garfield offered his blessing to Tom Holland, much like how Tobey Maguire praised Garfield previously. As luck would have it, Garfield was actually a huge proponent of the idea of the character appearing in the Marvel Cinematic Universe from the day he was cast. He noted that he wanted such a deal to happen, regardless of whether or not he would reprise his role as the character in the larger setting, and that he's happy to see these movies as a fan. According to Latino Review, Sony appeared to have an initial plan where the first Spider-Man movie would involve him as a high school superhero, with the intent of telling different stories with the character as the young actor grows older. In this plan, Spider-Man would have to audition to become an Avenger by fighting Iron Man in a friendly sparring match, similar to something that happened in the Ultimate line. And the movie would lay the foundation for the Sinister Six, setting up a reworked version of the movie that Sony had already planned to make. It appears as though this plan was made on the presumption that Spider-Man would not first appear in Captain America: Civil War, which features Spider-Man working alongside Iron Man as an Avengers recruit. As for the Sinister Six movie, it appears to have been shelved altogether. That being said, an important element to Drew Goddard's Sinister Six movie was actually being researched by Sony for the new Spider-Man movie. Bleeding Cool reported that Sony representatives were looking at Marvel Fanfare number 1 through 4 and Sensational Spider-Man numbers 13 through 15 for inspiration for a project. These issues all prominently feature the Savage Land, a setting that Marvel held the rights to. While nothing else shown so far has indicated the Savage Land will appear in the 2017 Spider-Man movie, it's possible that it could make an appearance down the road. According to Kevin Feige himself, the reboot is set to be a smaller film that will focus on Spider-Man's double life in high school and as a superhero. Feige compared the new Spider-Man reboot to a John Hughes movie in terms of what the team behind the film is looking to accomplish, with a large ensemble of supporting characters and a more personal story. Feige also noted that the movie will feature villains who have not appeared on screen before, with Mysterio, Kraven the Hunter, and the Vulture being rumored as potential candidates. Feige has also noted that he would like Spider-Man to cross over into the Netflix properties if possible, though this needs to be negotiated with Sony. As mentioned earlier, the leaked Sony emails strongly suggest that Marvel wants Spider-Man to appear in both parts of Avengers: Infinity War. Said emails also suggest that Sony wants the follow-up to the 2017 Spider-Man movie to arrive in 2019, following the second Infinity War movie. While Marvel's current schedule for films does not include a date for the sequel, with 2019 being reserved for Captain Marvel in addition to the Avengers film, it's likely that the movie's release date will be decided upon by Sony instead. The apparent delay of Inhumans would also present an open space that a Spider-Man movie could fill in 2019. While the deal is currently set to last until the end of Phase 3, it is likely that Sony and Marvel will continue their partnership indefinitely, provided that the new films do well. On April 4th, 2016, Sony registered the domain to SpidermanHomecomingTheMovie.com, strongly suggesting that Spider-Man Homecoming was the official title of the film. It should be noted that the title for the James Bond movie Skyfall was indirectly revealed in the same fashion. The title was unveiled on April 12th at a CinemaCon presentation, and confirmation that other MCU characters would be making appearances started up around this time. While some have associated the movie's apparent title with the first issue of The Amazing Spider-Man that was set after the original Secret Wars crossover, it's extremely unlikely that the movie will be an adaptation of that particular storyline. Many view the title as alluding to Spider-Man effectively returning home to the greater Marvel Universe. Others see it as a connection to the apparent high school focus that the movie will have. While the deal itself did not directly affect 20th Century Fox, it certainly did not go unnoticed. Since the announcement of the Sony-Marvel deal, rumors have come out that Fox may be trying to reach a similar deal with Marvel. The rumors hypothesize that Fox will reboot the X-Men setting into the MCU after the release of X-Men Apocalypse and the last Wolverine movie. But with the current success of the X-Men films on their own, this seems unlikely to be anything more than wishful thinking on the part of fans. Nonetheless, recent statements from Fox producer Simon Kinberg, who has ties to Disney, and Deadpool director Tim Miller, who did work on the opening sequence of Thor: The Dark World, imply that there actually is interest from their end, and that the Spider-Man and Avengers properties alike are key to it. In a statement to Crave Online, both Kinberg and Miller expressed a degree of interest in trying to heal the rift between the MCU and the X-Men series by means of an Avengers X-Men movie. More specifically, in a statement towards superhero hype, Miller explained a particular interest in quote-unquote trying to build bridges for a Spider-Man Deadpool team-up. For such a deal to work, however, there would most likely need to be a good degree of negotiation between Marvel Studios, Sony Pictures, and 20th Century Fox over the rights. And given the complications present with the MCU now including Spider-Man, it's likely that such a deal would take years to work out in the best possible scenario. While Sony is apparently content with their partnership with Marvel, currently there are two non-MCU projects in development. The non-MCU movies in development can be made at the cost of only being able to work with the limitations of the Spider-Man franchise on its own. The first film is an animated movie helmed by Christopher Lord and Philip Miller, the directors of the Lego Movie, and directors that Sony were interested in handing over the reins of the Spider-Man franchise. While Tom Rothman has stated the animated movie will be in continuity with the new version of Spider-Man, Sony has suggested that this may not be the case, and it was later clarified at CinemaCon that the movie would not be part of the MCU. The other film in discussion is the long-gestating Venom movie that's been in varying stages of planning since production of Spider-Man 3 was underway. No director is attached, but Avi Arad and Matt Tolmach, the team behind the two Amazing Spider-Man movies, are set to produce while Dante Harper has been hired to write a script. The movie itself seems to divorce the character from any ties to Spider-Man at all, akin to what New Line Cinema had in mind before Sony bought the film rights to the character from them. Although Arad has had plans to get the movie made for years, some view the decision to greenlight the project as a knee-jerk reaction to the success of Deadpool, presuming the planned movie will be rated R, or possibly even Arad's way of spiting Kevin Feige. It should be noted that Sony had plans for both the animated movie and the Venom movie long before their deal with Marvel, and they had tons of films planned to be included in the Amazing Spider-Man universe, as well as a handful of films set outside of the continuity. Stay tuned to Midnight's Edge for the final episode of this series, in which we discuss what Sony's original plans for the Spider-Man sequels and spin-offs were, and how they may play a role in the future of Sony and Marvel's respective film slates. If you like this video, please hit that subscribe button. Join us for spin-free news and analysis of the happenings and corporate politics behind the scenes of your favorite genre movies, as well as explorations of your favorite characters and their backgrounds and context here at Midnight's Edge.